Okay, so for our acrylic painting, there are round bristled brushes, round tipped. Then we have square or flat tip. Oh, that's another round tip. I thought I grabbed a flat tip, but it's square. It's cut off. You don't see that roundness to it. We have our rounded brush where it's not flat at all. It's round all the way around. This would be a detail rounded brush. We have a fan brush. The bristles on these acrylic brushes have a lot more stability and a lot more strength than the bristles on a watercolor brush where they absorb a lot of water. The acrylic brushes aren't going to absorb as much water. This is a watercolor brush if you would need it for a texture or something, but when you're applying the paint, you're going to want to use an acrylic brush. Alright, I also like to get my palette ready. We just started using paper plates for palettes, cup of clean water, and then your canvas that you're going to paint on. I always put newspaper underneath just because acrylic paint is a bugger to clean up, so it'll save you time. So I'm just going to label my notes, acrylic, painting, notes, and then I'm going to divide my paper into 8 boxes. Something like that. In each box I'm going to make a shape. And the only reason we want these shapes is so that you know how easy or how hard, difficult it is to stay inside the lines if you're trying to with each of our techniques. The first technique is a dry brush. And you'll see what they'll look like finished right here if you want to check that out. But a dry brush technique is literally a dry brush, and you can try any of your brushes, even try different brushes for different techniques. And you're going to load your brush. So loading your brush just means adding paint to it and then trying to touch your line without going past it. Again, just to see how detailed or how much control you have. I like to start inside and then pull my paint to the edge and wrap it if I have an inside to fill. Okay, so that would be the dry brush technique. When I'm cleaning my acrylic paint brushes, lots of times I'll wipe the paint off before I scrub it in the water. And when you scrub it, you just want to press it against the bottom and shake until you lift it up and see no more paint, and then just dab off the extra water. This would be considered a dry brush again, even though it's slightly damp because I took the extra water out of it. Alright, so my next is an underpainting. And you're going to start out with neutrals. Then you're going to let it dry. And then you're going to come back over it with a color wash. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and use a round tipped brush here. I'm going to do my highlights first. And I'm going to add just a slightly little bit of black to my white. And you'll notice how little black you need to really overpower that white. I thought I grabbed as little as I could and it still really overpowered it. So I'm just creating my value using neutrals. Sometimes people will use like raw umber or burnt sienna instead of their grays, which is perfectly acceptable. We just happen to have a lot of black paint, so I chose black. And sometimes when I want to blend, I'm going to get that excess paint off my brush, and then I just want to pull my paint that's on my canvas next to one another, or into one another, and use what's there. So now I have what looks like the illusion of a form, right? And I did that just using values of a neutral color. So that's an underpainting. We're going to let that dry. We'll come back to that again later. Dabbing and stippling are very similar. With a dab, I'm going to use the side of my brush. And with a stipple, I'm going to use the tip. So what you're going to do is, I like to do it with a dry brush, so I'm going to get the water out of my brush. add my color. And a dab is literally just loading your brush and letting the texture be the texture. I'm using the side of my brush to fill in my areas. The shape of your brush and the type of bristle will make a big difference on the texture you get from your dab. Okay, a stipple, I'm just going to press and lift just like with the dab. I'm going to use a different color for this. Actually, I'll use the orange. But you want to use the tip of your brush, so you're going for a point and not necessarily a texture, right? More controlled. Lots of times with a stipple, I'll use the back side of my paintbrush because it's easier for me to get perfect dots with the back side. And you could layer it, but if I layered it, my paints would mix if I did it while it was wet. I could go back over it when it's dry. Yes, Paige? Oh, just watching? Okay. So the dab versus the stipple. The flick. So the flick is not something that's meant to try and stay inside the lines. It's more about creating a texture with your brush. So you can load just the tip or you can load your whole brush. It's going to look different depending on how you do it. But you want to pull from inside to out. And you'll notice it looks almost like a teardrop when you flick. This brush has a lot of water in it. If I dry my brush more, I'll get more of a texture. Do you see how you get more texture the drier the brush? A different brush, like a harder bristled brush here, is going to create an even stronger texture. But flicking is literally, you're going to have it thicker at the base, and as you pull it out, it gets thinner and creates a texture towards the edges. A wash. So far, I've pretty much shown you dry brush technique. I'm not adding water to my paint. My first flick had a little bit of water in it, but not purposefully. But a wash with acrylic paints is liquefying the acrylics so that they're almost working like watercolors. So I'm not cleaning off the excess water. If I touch my hand, you'll hopefully see that I get a dab of water in my hand. So I'm leaving water loaded in my brush. I'm picking up paint with the water loaded in my brush. And I'm pulling my paint around. And you'll notice that it looks really translucent. I have less control, just like a watercolor. But it's going to dry more opaque than a watercolor would. The layering technique. You can layer two ways. You can layer wet paint on wet paint or wet paint on dry paint. So I'm going to break this in half and I'm just going to do a dry brush technique over the whole thing. Notice how much I use my newspapers just to clean my brushes. Oops. Alright, so I'm just going to do a dry brush technique on the whole thing. Now, even though the brush was dry, the paint's still wet. And that's what we're talking about with this wet on wet technique. So now if I go in with another color and mix them, when my paint is wet, I'm going to be able to like blend them into one another and merge those colors. When my paint is dry and I do a layer, I'm going to see it more on top and my second color is going to appear brighter. But we're going to come back to this one in just a bit after it's dried. Alright, a double load. Alright, so a double load can be done many ways. There's not one right way, but usually the most common way is you're going to use a flat brush, not a round brush, so that you have two sides. And you're going to load one side with one color and load the other side with the other color. So it looks something like that. And you can use the side of the brush and pull, right, for different effects. Or I can take the yellow side and pull down and just get a little orange in it. Or I can take the orange side and pull down and get a yellow in it, a little bit of yellow in it. A lot of landscapes, nature paintings, flowers are using the double loading technique. Some artists will triple and quadruple load their colors, or they'll just not clean their brushes and let it happen naturally. But that's just like the double load technique. And if I go in a circle, I'm running out of paint here, but you can kind of see how you can learn to manipulate your colors and create effects with the double load. It's fun to practice with. And then lastly is detailing. When we're painting, we usually save our detailing for the last or the end. Detailed brushes can be flat or round, but they're small, right? Do you see how that has a small amount of bristles? If I want a tiny little detailed circle, I might stipple it because I have more control with a stipple. But what I want you guys to do when you're practicing detailing, I want you to practice following the outline of your shape with an even line thickness and an even amount of paint. And it's just like a skill, but there might be places you want very specific details represented, and you need to have practice doing that and understand the concept behind it to be successful at it. Now, usually if I'm detailing, I will detail once my paint for my underpainting things is dry. I'll save my details for the very last. But I want you just to try and practice the even line thickness, even paint color. So it's thicker some places. I'm just going back in and cleaning that up. I'm going to stop, but hopefully you get the point there. And those are the 8 techniques that I'm exposing you to. There are so many more, but if you practice these, hopefully you can get an idea which ones you'd want to use as your artist or for your painting.